Hey everyone, and welcome back to Science with Sarah. Get ready because this is the first science video of my channel, and today we will be talking about insulin resistance. Let's get started. The first question we should start by answering is, what is insulin? So it's important to know that the cells in your body mainly use glucose, which is a type of sugar, and they use it for energy. Insulin is a hormone that is secreted by beta cells, which are produced by regions in the pancreas, called islets of Langerhans, which is depicted very simply in the circle here. It makes sure that the body maintains normal glucose levels in your blood, but it also broadly contributes to maintaining homeostatic metabolism of carbohydrates, fats, and protein. To do that, insulin makes it easier for glucose to be brought into the cells and allows the excess glucose to be stored mainly in the cells of muscle, fat, and liver to keep until needed. So glucose can be stored in liver and muscle cells as glycogen mainly, and in the liver and fat cells as fatty acids, which then become triglycerides or fat as part of a mechanism called de novo lipogenesis. So overall, insulin promotes energy storage and promotes the clearance of blood sugars from the blood. So what happens when you eat? When you eat carbohydrates, for example, which contain glucose, insulin is quickly released from the beta cells in the pancreas to the blood. It can then bring the glucose molecules to cells to produce energy or to store it until needed, and then blood sugar levels will go down. When you eat protein, insulin can also stimulate uptake of amino acids, which are the building blocks of protein, from the blood to the liver to synthesize protein there. The fat that you eat will also end up in the liver to make triglycerides and will then be sent to fat cells to be stored there. So then what happens when you fast or don't eat? So when you're fasting or when you're not eating, of course insulin levels are decreased because there's no glucose in the blood. And instead of reaching out to the beta cells, the alpha cells are called in by the pancreas and they produce glucagon, which has pretty much the opposite effect of insulin, and its goal is really to bring blood sugar levels up when they're low. So then the glucagon that's produced goes to the liver where it can break down glycogen into glucose, which can then be released into the blood to increase blood sugar levels. Since the liver can't do it all, eventually the fat cells will help and will begin to break down the stored triglycerides into free fatty acids, which can be used by the muscle or the heart. And during an even longer fasting period, the liver uses these fatty acids too. And it's through this that you're pretty much burning fat. The muscle will also begin to break down its glycogen stores into glucose so that it has energy too. So how does insulin bring the glucose inside the cells? When the insulin comes into contact with a cell, to provide it with glucose, it binds to its receptor, intuitively called the insulin receptor. You can think about the insulin receptor as a lock and insulin as the key that's super specific to these locks, which is a common analogy for this mechanism. So when insulin binds to its receptor, it signals, hey, I'm here and I'm ready to give you some glucose. Upon binding, vesicles form that contain glucose transporter 4, or GLUT4, which, as its name implies, transports glucose, and they emerge from inside the cell to the cell surface and bring the glucose that the insulin provides inside the cell. Most of the insulin then goes back into circulation and ultimately arrives in the kidney where it can be degraded. So what happens in the cell? Once the glucose is taken up by the cell, inside the cell many things occur. As we mentioned before, glucose can be used for energy production. It can be stored as glycogen or as triglycerides, but it also stops the breakdown of triglycerides and stimulates protein synthesis. So now the big question is, how do you become insulin resistant? Insulin resistance is largely due to increased calorie consumption, but also is dependent on the type of carbohydrates that you're eating. So different type of carbohydrates can raise blood sugar in different ways. Some can raise it very high, others don't. But we will get back to this point in a later video when I'll be talking about dietary management of insulin resistance. So let's talk about increased food intake to illustrate what's going on. If you're eating a lot, and in particular a lot of the carbohydrates that make your blood sugar increase, now that we understand what's happening in your body, we can think about it rationally. So since you're over-consuming these things that increase blood sugar, your insulin is probably going to go crazy trying to store it and get rid of the sugar that's in the blood. So you'd assume that if insulin did a good job, this should work fine. But there's a limit to the amount of glucose in the form of glycogen and triglycerides that your cells can store, especially in the liver and the fat. So over time, these cells will get bigger because they're storing more and more. But there's a breaking point, and the cells will no longer accept the glucose that the insulin is trying to stuff them with. So essentially, the cell modifies the insulin receptor to prevent insulin from binding to it. At this point, the pancreas thinks that insulin isn't doing a very good job because there's still a lot of sugar in the blood since it's not being put into the cells. So the pancreas will naturally send out more insulin to try and reduce the blood sugar that it senses, which of course doesn't help either. At the same time, cells that are too full are going to start releasing sugar and fat into the blood to alleviate some of the pressure that they're feeling, which also contributes to increasing blood sugar levels, but also increasing triglyceride and cholesterol levels into the blood and causing fat to accumulate in the muscle. So now in your blood you have high levels of sugar, which is a state called hyperglycemia, but you also have high levels of insulin too, because remember, the pancreas is trying to get those blood sugars down, so it keeps pumping insulin out. And this state of high levels of insulin in the blood is called hyperinsulinemia, which also can induce even more insulin resistance. Anyways, eventually, the beta cells in the pancreas start failing because they've become exhausted from pumping so much insulin, and as blood sugar levels keep rising, this will ultimately lead to type 2 diabetes. So that was a simplified explanation of how cells can become insulin resistant. I also want to add that insulin resistance is common in most metabolic diseases like obesity, dyslipidemia, metabolic syndrome, hypertension, atherosclerosis, and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Why are the causes of insulin resistance controversial? So at this point, research is still not 100% clear about what happens. Many things can contribute to causing insulin resistance, and I'll go over some of the key points. First, and perhaps most logical, is the process we just explained, in that putting cells in this state is not good, and they know that. So they have ways to protect themselves too. And one of the ways they can do that is by reducing the expression of their receptors to stop glucose from coming into the cells by preventing insulin to bind. Second, the more fat cells expand, especially in visceral fat, the more inflammation they cause by producing factors called pro-inflammatory cytokines. These factors can directly jam up the signals that are sent from the insulin receptor and block insulin signaling, which can contribute to the development and maintenance of insulin resistance. There are also other factors such as mitochondrial dysfunction or even mutations in GLUT4 that may also contribute to insulin resistance. So I hope this video was clear and easy to follow. Don't hesitate to let me know if you have any questions. My next video will be on type 2 diabetes, so get excited. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.